Like, that's not an issue if we're talking about theoretical physics. Like, so long as NASA hears about it, we're okay. We're going to get that rocket to the moon. We don't need George to understand how to make a better bottle rocket to shoot it into Tom's backyard. Like, that's okay that that is not being disseminated to the public. But if you're telling me that exercise science studies intended for the public to change behavior are not being read by the public, we've got a problem.
Welcome to the N1 Experience, brought to you by N1 Education, the leader in fitness education.
First, here we are back talking about science again and what that means. I think last time the focus of the conversation was on the term evidence-based, and now we're switching to science-based. So, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's right.
So I have already had, or people will see the conversation that I've had with Pack and Bromley before this one. So I think right now the consensus seems to be, at least in all of these conversations and even just a little bit of time I talked to you, is that this isn't really a science versus practice discussion that we're having, but it's more about the, we'll say, the usage or the way the terminology is being portrayed, and then just the people or the talking heads involved in this space. And you did I think it was like a 2-hour episode on this, but if you want to just give people like the cliff notes of kind of that, and then I'll link the full thing below, we can use that kind of as the kickoff here.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the opportunity to do so. Yeah, we had an Iron Culture episode where it was myself, Omar, and Trexler talking about this. And Omar was the one who moderated the discussion, which I thought was good, but I didn't really think went anywhere between Pac, Milo, and Alexander Bromley, which he would admit to. And I don't think it was due to the moderation. And I don't even necessarily think it was due to any of the people involved in the conversation. I think it was people talking past each other, as often occurs. And I think is probably what we're going to talk about today. And I kind of pointed out, and I used a framing that actually Omar brought up in that debate, that there's a couple of different points where you can say, where is there room for improvement across the line of incorporating science into practice? You know, there is the consumer, the person who ultimately gets information and decides what to do with it, who we could place blame upon, but I think we're just kind of getting annoyed at traits of the human race, you know, and our tendency to confirm biases and only want to give the level of effort needed to understand the topic. And like, why aren't you reading the full text? It's like, well, why would you expect them to, right? I'm just trying to get jacked over here. Just the same way you wouldn't go to your mechanic and be like, okay, let me read this book on engineering so that I make an informed decision about what you're going to do with my car. The consumer is the consumer, and next up the chain is the science communicator. And the science communicator is where a lot of what I think the debates are occurring, and the stress is occurring. And there are science communicators who also happen to be one level up the chain, not that it's hierarchical, but maybe lateral, I will say. People producing the actual research, involved in actually conducting studies, and there are science communicators who are not. And they may or may not be practitioners as well. And you can have a science communicator who is a practitioner and a researcher. You can have someone who is a science communicator and they're very good at understanding research and a practitioner. You can have a science communicator who's not good at understanding the research, but tries and is also a practitioner, or anywhere in between. And I think that's where there's probably the highest opportunity for improving things, which I feel I'm qualified to speak on because I'm in all three locations. I try to do all three, and I have done for, you know, I was a practitioner. I was an athlete first. I was the consumer, right? I remember being just the consumer of information for a long time. Just like, I'm trying to get jacked over here. Why are you telling me all this complexity? How much protein should I eat post-workout? Tell me now one number. And I want to just make that my Bible. I remember being the various degrees of proficiency with understanding scientific research communicator and coach. Those came not in that order, the opposite order. I was a coach for a while, and then I started incorporating research. And then eventually, you know, starting with my my research-based master's in late 2012, but actually not until 2013 when the study actually started up, did I actually get in the lab and do research in an applied sector. And then that has progressed, and I've done all three with just, different levels of each. So when I look at the field, I'm very aware of all the issues in that final, connection of what can science do better. But that's a very kind of insular thing. Like a lot scientists spend most of their time critiquing other science. So we're not new to the critiques of science by any means. And I think it's just interesting now to see that there is a relatively large movement that I think is in broader society as well. And this does happen cyclically. Like this goes all the way back to like Galileo, right? And probably further, of there being critiques and attacks on science as if it is if it's a thing, or things like the ivory tower. And I don't think they're invalid by any means, but I think there's almost the assumption that the scientists themselves are unaware of the issues, not doing anything to address them. It hasn't changed over time. And also there's a lack of awareness because of not being involved in it, which things are modifiable currently, which ones aren't, which ones are actually problems, which ones are perceived problems, the magnitude that they impact things, and whether they should be quantified and fixed, which is the case in most cases, or is it just kick it over, drain the swamp, like science needs to be redone by people who aren't in science. I've had comments like, specifically because you have a PhD, you're worse at contributing, like you're worse at providing information. Like the dedicated study of this on top of being a coach and an athlete has actually made me worse at what I do, and I've had that comment more than once, which is kind of like a mind-blowing belief. And I feel like this is just kind of an extension of that. So there's absolutely, and there will always be things to work on within the scientific community. But I think the largest place where we run into problems with misinformation, potential active disinformation, because conflicts of interest are rife in the science communication space. Like you and I both sell coaching courses, books, it takes a lot of transparency, diligence, and, hoping that the principle of charity holds true when you listen to most science communicators. There are very few quote unquote pure science communicators, and even the more pure ones who are maybe just a researcher who spends a lot of time communicating science without having any income attached to that, at the very least is human and is going to have their biases, which are going to, come into what they communicate. So yeah, that conversation we had was designed to help people better understand, like, what is the actual issue, what is going on here, and where are there opportunities for improving that chain. And I think we agreed that the consumer, like, you can get mad about it, you can rant about it, but placing blame on the consumer without active steps on what an individual does is not very helpful. And that's a lot of my career, is telling people, hey, okay, here's how you want to focus on position stands from these relatively large organizations, systematic reviews. That way you don't have to rely too much on your understanding of how meta-analyses are done. No individual study should change X, Y, and Z. If it completely conflicts with what's being done in practice, think about that. What can anecdotes tell us? We know they're at least not a barrier to success if everyone's doing it and they're being successful, but they may not be required or optimal. Yada, 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 yada. Like, think of things in priorities rather than black and white. My career has been trying to arm the consumer with the ability to make better informed decisions. And then my career as a science communicator has just been always trying to get better at this thing and doing it right. And my career as a researcher also has been me trying to get better at doing good science. But the reason why I was motivated to do that podcast is large in part, which I think we're going to talk about today, Kassem, was that there seems to be this conception of science as an institution almost, or as a centrally mandated kind of consensus that is like gatekeepy and an elite club. And sometimes what I think is unfortunately true, that the people who follow science-based information that they will elevate certain voices to a degree that I don't even think most people who hold those credentials want to be elevated to, because the basis of the kind of philosophy underlying science is to ask questions, not have definitive answers. And to some degree, the issues with the fitness industry, where we tend to have gurus, we tend to, you know, have camps, silos, tribes, if you will, which is, of course, an issue across all topics. They're exacerbated by that. Instead of going, oh, now I'm going to adopt an evidence-based approach or a science-based approach or whatever you want to call it, I'm going to include empirical data into my decision-making process. They forget the philosophy of science underlying that needs to come with it. And then we go, okay, sweet. So our new gurus are just simply, you know, people who have PhDs. And that is just as much of a problem as making anybody your guru. And the number of people with MDs and PhDs who put out bullshit, you know, diets and books, they're the most damaging when you look at some of the data on it, because they have that societal trust. The MD who comes out, your Paul Saladinos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, who we can all think of. Yeah, the liver kings are kind of problems, but most of the popular Liver King had was out of kind of like this morbid fascination of watching a car crash. You know, it's a guy wearing a buffalo hat, you know, talking in a deep voice, sitting in a golden throne. It's not, I'm a medical, you know, I have a book to sell you. I have an MD, and everything we thought we knew about health is wrong. Let me use scare tactics. And I also can talk a good game that'll even loop in a lot of intellectuals who are not an expert in this field, but I can hook, line, and sinker you. So I do think that misapplication of scientific credentials is very damaging. And I understand the reaction to that of, man, how do I trust science now? And I think it's very understandable. But I think the real issue is that we're putting science in a box and seeing it as an institution when it is completely not like that and doesn't operate in that way, in terms of its very organic, reactive, and independent, almost cell-like structure. When we think of how do universities operate, how is science done, are journals connected, what are the quote-unquote rules? And I think it would be pretty eye-opening for anyone who had a relatively anti-science institution tilt to understand that. And that's even more so true when we're talking about exercise science or sports nutrition science, and we don't have things like NIH funding, or, you know, like huge, like the American Heart Association is a little bit bigger than the NSCA. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I don't think people understand that, or that the ISSN was basically just a bunch of like ex-bodybuilders who were really interested in protein, who decided to go to grad school, who got together and said, you know, we should make like a society, bro. And then they put on a conference every year and want you to take their certification so they can retire, you know? So like, I think if people understood what quote unquote science is in our sector, they would understand that it is probably not what they think. And many of the critiques, concerns, or issues, they wouldn't go away, but they would change. And the potential solution would also probably be something different, rather than reject all and just go with what feels good.
Yeah, when Alex and I were talking, one of the points that I brought up was, I think people underestimate just how much of what they're doing is built on science.
Yes.
And that's because they're kind of like, they're putting science into the box of it's only the latest study on this like obtuse variable like volume or failure or whatever, and not understanding that like they're applying anatomy and physics and physiology in almost all of the decisions they make, whether it's choosing the exercise and how to cue somebody, etc. And so I think that was a helpful part of like understanding, hey, you have to, if you have to take science for everything that it is, you can't just be like, hey, look, currently we don't have really good data on this one very, very specific thing, or we have a broad range, or there's, you know, we have two different tribes around the same thing, even within the research-based community, if you will. And it's, yeah, okay, sure, as a consumer, it's very hard if I'm like, okay, both of these guys have the same credentials, but they have totally opposite interpretations on what the current body of evidence says. That tends to only be on the smallest,
Yes.
hardest variables, but the vast majority of what we actually use in the field comes from the more foundational sciences. It is the anatomy and the physics and stuff that we're building upon, right? Every machine that you get in, right? The engineering that went into that, okay? The list of exercises that you have currently in your library, all of those to some degree rely on the foundational sciences. So I think that was kind of helpful in moving the conversation of, okay, there is so much that we are benefiting from science, but from the consumer level, the question I'll ask you, because you brought up the credentials thing, is credentials are basically meant to inform the consumer. And I feel like whether we're talking PhDs or we're simply just talking like, oh, I'm a whatever IFBB pro or like, have credentials lost their usefulness to the consumer in the fitness space? Or do you still think that the probability is there? And if so, how good of a probability is it?
Good framing. The first thing I want to say, Kassem, is it's an excellent point, just how much science is involved when we don't think of it as science. And I do think that stems from us drawing a very particular circle around what science is. And it's, the recent debate on Twitter about this study, or why aren't all the scientists talking about the absurdity of this 52 set study? Like there's this volume cabal where we don't want to acknowledge the absurdity of it, but why didn't you call out that study, but you called out others? And not noticing that I have not called out a single individual study, and we're actually pointing to meta-analyses, and that's what you do. And I don't want to give more press than one study deserves when it's already getting talked about by everybody. Just one example of a misunderstanding and what comes of that, and kind of what you see in the comments section. And I completely agree that credentials are leveraged for those reasons, to hopefully give more credibility to a given thing. Credentials, credibility, they probably share some word ideology that I don't know. But I think they've never been a perfect one-to-one proxy for someone's knowledge base. I think so first off, it might be helpful for people to understand that there's like 10 different versions of having a doctorate. There's EDDs, there's DSCs, there's PhDs, and then those differ in every single country and institution on what you have to do. You may have had a Viva or a Defense, you may have not. You may have taken 2 years of methodology classes before you could even get into the doctorate. Or maybe you're in the European system and you just had better education first and then didn't need to do that. And it was a research only degree that you did. And you may have and what does PhD even mean? Most people don't understand it. Every PhD is actually a doctorate in philosophy. What's the topic and what's the philosophy in? It's in the philosophy of that. So, I mean, credentials themselves have a lot more variance than I think people realize. And they have more to do with saying that this person met all the criteria at the institution that awarded it, which is externally decided upon being able to award this thing. And there you go. And it is only actually the clinical qualifications like RD, like a physiotherapist, like an MD, etc., where it is actually intended to go right. And we've decided that you're safe to go out into the world and practice. And I think that there should actually be a much higher level of critique leveled at people with clinical qualifications that are based upon me having a defined scope of practice and going out there and doing that. Anyone with a PhD is someone who has done a really, 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 really deep dive on a given topic. I think as far as understanding the broad sciences, a very good bachelor's student, and probably more so a master's student, is going to have a similar grasp compared to a PhD if you were to control for just time spent in the field. The difference between me and someone who just completed their master's is that I just did that 12 years ago, right? So that means I've just had more time to think about and use these things because I'm also an active learner, assuming we're both active learners. But if that master's student did their master's 12 years ago, but they spent the last 12 years coaching people, reading research and thinking about it, I think when it came to, say, general applications of science to something like exercise or sport, I don't think you can reliably say, well, he has a PhD that's higher than a master's and that's higher than a bachelor's. The reason I give a slight edge to the master's student is mainly because education is behind the times, which is ironic that we're talking about science. And we largely teach memorization, and textbooks are out of date, and we don't teach critical thinking skills. Like if even our methods papers, there's actually research on this, where if you teach someone a graduate level methods course, how science is conducted, like how does an ultrasound work, and then how do we do statistics, p-testing, and adequate sample size, and what's the difference between a crossover versus a case control, et cetera, and which ones can and can't tell us inferences about causation. That actually doesn't inform people about critical thinking, even though it's tangentially related to it. There's a study where they compared a traditional scientific methods class to a logical thinking and critical analysis class, and noticing things like cognitive dissonance, logical fallacies. And they found that the number of students in those two classes who continued to hold untenable beliefs, things that were conflicting, not always necessarily conspiracy theories, but many of the beliefs that are internally illogical, right? That most humans hold on to despite the evidence presented to them, was reduced only in the quote unquote, what I'll call a critical thinking class, but not in the methods class. So that's the reason I give the edge to the master's student, is they start to engage with those things, and they are challenged in the thesis or dissertation process and by their advisor once they get to the research portion of their master's, if it has a research portion, and at least to some degree when they get into the coursework that is specifically designed to help them critically analyze research, rather than just the bachelor student is typically getting, you can't go to Wikipedia only. Okay, here's this thing called PubMed. Here's what a study is. And they go, oh, I didn't even know. And this is a problem, which I will talk about in academia. Most bachelor students don't even know that the professors who teach their classes have some time allocated to their 40 hours work of week of doing research. And that the difference between a bachelor's and a master's and a PhD student is that they're creating research, and that's done at universities. We don't even know that as bachelor students. We just know scientists are the ones in that sci-fi movie who wear the white coats and they get paid by the government, and then they're actually doing something nefarious, or they say, hey, we can't do that, and the government shoots them, and then they do it anyway, right? That's our conception of scientists, right? Not they are spending time teaching this undergraduate course, or in reality, their graduate student is teaching the undergraduate course, and then, they're doing research, or in reality, their graduate students doing the research, right? So I don't think people actually understand how science is done, and it doesn't even start to occur until they're at the master's level. And at the bachelor's level, they're typically not given those critical thinking skills. They're kind of just told to accept that these are how things operate. So there's a big disparity between those bachelor's programs. If they actually give you critical thinking skills and challenge you, and they're a little more modern in terms of education, then maybe they are on the same level as a master's. And so long as you stay as a lifelong learner, perhaps I don't think the average personal trainer would benefit from getting a PhD. I think it's helpful to understand that a PhD is like a deep, deep dive. And there is a saying, and I'm going to misattribute the exact paraphrasing of it, and I don't even know who actually said it, but that you can learn something about everything from mastering one thing. And I think that is true, because once you understand just how deep a rabbit hole can go, and the complexities of sometimes very benign topics, and how much nuance there can be and context, that's what, the Dunning-Kruger actual research, when you look at it, that's kind of what you're seeing, is the understanding that, oh shit, there's more to this than I knew there was. And hopefully with a little bit of intellectual humility and awareness, and not a whole lot of expert creep, which we see a lot of these days, that person with the PhD is going to realize that applies everywhere outside of their one little deep dive they did. And hopefully they're a little more intellectually humble. But confirmation bias, conflicts of interest, financial stuff, all of that is going to color that ego. And being platformed and given the opportunity to be wrong and not wanting to look dumb in front of other people. All these things contribute to why we see false information coming from MDs, PhDs, et cetera. So to directly answer your question, I would say that it does reduce the probability of someone giving you less correct information as you go up from, say, no credential at all to personal trainer certification to bachelor's to master's. And then I think if the topic is within the specific domain of that person's credential, that will keep rising as you get to the level of, say, PhD, MD, et cetera. But if it's not, I don't think, I think there's probably no correlation. You know, like if you were to ask me about heart disease, I don't think I would have given a better answer 10 years ago than I would today, because maybe slightly, because it's not my thing. But if you were to ask Eric Helms about autoregulation in 2012, before I had done my PhD on autoregulation versus 2017, I would give a more correct answer. And that is specifically because I spent 4 years studying it and thinking about it all the time. So I think to some degree there must be a relationship. Not everyone necessarily is staying as an active learner or as open-minded in that process. And some people, despite the safeguards upon what should be the criteria for completing a degree, are prevented from chasing an incorrect hypothesis or line of thinking all the way through to the end. But I think that is less often happening than things are being done well. So I think the higher someone's credential is, it's more that you know that they have done that deep dive, but they're still human.
So I want to ask you this, even though half the people listening to this may be like, all right, let's move on to the next thing. But this is all about me, and you guys can just deal with it. Do you think that there is a point where you're almost lagging behind by continuing to pursue the education versus the experience? If we take your example of, okay, you take the master's with a little bit of experience over a PhD, right? Is there a point, especially if you're going to the extent of pursuing a PhD and you're being so laser focused, do you actually maybe potentially, if we're talking about carrying that into the field, are you actually going behind a little bit because you're missing so much of the broad picture and maybe some of the other elements that are equally or maybe even more important, that then almost it's okay, now I have to catch back up so that this thing that I've specialized is even applicable or significant at this point? Because my experience has been, and to be honest, sometimes this has even been within the field of study, but there's this, when people are educated and experienced, it's like they get it. And then people that are educated and not experienced just don't get it. And that's definitely best to be, to me, in my opinion, educated and experienced than just experienced. Right. But I find that in terms of that Dunning-Kruger effect, I think a lot of times some of my, we'll say, most challenging interactions have come from the people that have the highest ratio of education to experience. And it seems like almost they just don't even understand me making points about things that are outside of that field, right? Like if we take the range of motion topic right now or whatever, and we look at like, well, that's one variable. There's so many other variables into choosing what the most ideal or optimal exercise would be for a person. You have all of the other factors, to go through. And I'm seeing this trend now of, okay, now we're just going to pick the best exercise, science-based or whatever. And instead of it being based off of all the science as a whole, it's based off of, here's this one single variable that either I know about or I care about, and everything else, even if it's mentioned, gets ranked significantly lower.
Yep. Yeah, there's a few things there. So I'll try to deal with them sequentially. First, I'm really glad that you started with, you think, to get a really high credential, it takes away and puts you behind. And then you provided some nuance to what that means. because I think that's incredibly important. There's undoubtedly an opportunity cost. There's an opportunity cost to saying, you know what, I'm not going to stay with school. I'm just going to be in the trenches, right? You're going to not get some skills there. And there's also an opportunity cost to say, I need to cut my client load down to a quarter to do my PhD, which I did. I didn't cut down to zero though. And that means that you are, by function of us living in a world with time and space, you cannot do as much of the thing you were doing before when you do a new thing that takes up that time. There is only 24 hours in a day. And even if you were to try to do both, there is a finite amount of active learning and attention that you can give to something rather than just being there and doing it. And I think we can also think of many practitioners who settled on a way of doing things a long time ago and haven't changed in a long time. And their beliefs are going to be their beliefs. You know, there may be somebody who does a lot of fives who we can both think of as a good avatar for that, you know, or I can think of a lot of people. They're very, very dogmatic. They achieved a certain level of popularity early on in their career. And then the placebo effect and their halo effect reinforces it, because the people who come to them already like what they're doing and want to work with them. They do well. And then that practitioner at best stays at the same level or even gets worse as their anecdotes get confirmed, as more and more people who are sycophants become the people they look at, and they decide everyone else who doesn't do well is doing it wrong or doesn't have enough personal responsibility, right? And I think we see this trajectory arc of many people in like the fitness industry who get worse into like their mid-stage career. They fall behind the times because they're stuck in the way they did it. So even staying in one field, if you're not an active learner, you will fall broadly behind. But specifically, I 100% agree that by choosing to do a deep dive into a PhD or sports science or academia or something like that, it takes time away from you developing, you know, in the trenches, quote unquote, experiences coaching people. However, it depends on what field you're in. So my experiments that I did for my PhD involved me driving to the 5 biggest powerlifting gyms in Auckland and working with national level New Zealand powerlifters and running them through a training program that was auto-regulated. So it's not like that doesn't share a huge Venn diagram overlap, but that's different than, say, going to Keith Barr's lab if I'd stayed in Sacramento, going to UC Davis and, you know, in a petri dish messing with collagen and a muscle cell or, you know, a tendon cell, right? I think there's a huge difference between those two things, right? There's a big difference between going to do your master's in, like, say, Brad Schoenfeld's lab and taking a whole bunch of jack dudes through a protocol to failure and comparing it to failure in a higher rep range. Like, you are getting a bit of both and you're doing it in a controlled setting. So I think that needs to be said, that applied science, sports nutrition, and then mechanistic science is quite different, you know, like us figuring out in vitro or in a rat model how leucine operates, for example, is very different than I fed a bunch of people protein while dieting. And I got, like for my master's, for example, and this is not about me, but it's an example of, I think I'm a useful avatar that I can speak confidently on because I did it, that my master's, I gave people diets that I customized based upon their weight change and their energy intake, and then their personal preferences. We adjusted it over time, and then I gave them a higher proportion of protein or not. I tested their body comp pre and post, and I also assessed daily analysis of life demands of athletes and the profile of mood states. Like, how did you feel during that period? And I tested their strength afterwards. In coaching, I will give someone a customized, you know, nutrition plan, a modifiable to their personal preferences with a certain amount of protein or not based upon some things. I ask them how they feel, and I test to see how it worked. So ton of overlap, right, between what I was doing, because I'm doing research that's supposed to be the last link in the chain serving the practitioner. I'm trying to do translational research is what we call it, sometimes applied research. I think translational when working with humans is far more, it communicates what it's supposed to do. It's the last leg after we've established potential theory, a mechanism. We've taken it and looked at it in a more reductionist fashion. Okay, it does have an effect. well, let's take it to the trenches and see what happens when we actually try it. And one of the things that science, quote unquote, is getting better at these days, and something I do with a lot of my students and that I see other people doing, is doing interviews with coaches and athletes, not just to see what they're doing and then just kind of put it out there as a publication, but to actually inform the subsequent research that's being done. And I think that's critically important, especially in fields where we don't really have a good idea of what's being done or what's normative, et cetera. But that's a tangent. So anyway, I'll say that you're going to get varying degrees of how much that opportunity cost impact you to do a deep dive into the research. And I will finally say, and this is going to very much support your point in like the last bit or part of it, that if I had to choose someone who is an active learner, who sometime, like let's say they graduated high school and they were an athlete, but that was about it. And that was what their interest in sport was. And they decided, let me do a bachelor's. And they just maybe were a trust fund baby. They didn't have to be a personal trainer during that time period or whatever. They, they got a scholarship. You decide how this person didn't work in a field that gave them personal training experience while doing let's say a bachelor's in exercise physiology. Because if they do sports science, they're gonna have co-op placements, all that stuff, or an S&C degree. That's the thing, is there's also these very specific applied degrees that exist today that did not exist 10 years ago. So someone who has a PhD now who you might be engaging with, who you feel is like really missing some of the practical stuff, they're probably from an older generation, I will say. So let's say, okay, they get an exercise physiology bachelor's degree, trust fund baby, getting no experience, and it's kind of an old stuffy style institution. And then they go right into a master's in exercise immunology, right? They spend that time doing, proteome analyses of various responses after people do cycling trials or something like that. And then finally, they do a PhD in clinical sports nutrition, where they look at hepcidin as a marker for low energy availability or something like that, right? But it's all done in an animal model. They run these rats on a treadmill until they get to low energy availability, feed in the same amount. The other group doesn't run on the treadmill, and they do iron status markers in these rats. Okay, this could be a real person out there. Someone's listening to this like, fuck, Eric, that's what I did for my PhD, right? And they get on Twitter and start talking about training protocols of bodybuilders. I would guarantee that, especially if they're relatively arrogant and you didn't have the right personality types, that they would give worse advice than someone who just spent the entire time as a trainer, for sure. No question, right? And I think that's important to acknowledge. However, if that trainer was the people who I talked about earlier, they're going to be off on some things earlier when, like, if they buy into their own bullshit early on in their career. Being an active learner is very important, but if I had to take someone who had 20 years of training experience or a pure mechanistic, even exercise physiology or nutritional physiology clinical type approach, I would take the person with the experience every time because they're actually doing the thing, right? But a sports scientist or a sports nutrition researcher, I think, who doing a translational research, that is not comparable to that. It's actually closer to the person who stayed in the trenches the whole time than it is to the person who got the same qualification. They might both have CSCS after their name or FISSN or whatever it is, PhD. They might both have a university affiliation, but I think to the average person, they're not going to understand the distinction between someone who's done cell cultures their whole career and someone who, has an IOC appointment and did applied research on actual athletes during the end season,
Mm-hmm. A lot of times students will ask if I think it's worth pursuing like X, Y, to Z degree, as well as taking X, Y, Z courses. And kind of the sweet spot that I've kind of narrowed it down on is asking them like how they want to pursue continuing to learn. And because I think that like when it comes to being able to read and evaluate research for yourself, you need the formal education background. But if the way that you want to learn is you want to go and learn from other experts that are already disseminating that information down, then there's a lot less benefit of having that formal education. If that's going to be the approach that you take, is you're just going to go to seminars and coaches and listen to people that are already serving as the middle person between the research and you. And I'm like, okay, if that's where you want to be, then you may not have to climb that academic ladder as high. But if you want to be the person that can sit down and actually read through the research yourself, then that's where I think that getting, climbing further up that ladder of academia is really helpful. And kind of being somewhere in the middle myself, I feel like I'm close to that sweet spot. But,
Yeah.
like when it comes to reading some of these papers on the physics of Titan and stuff like that, is hard, right? Like it's
That's hard for me,
right?
bro.
And I can't do statistics like Trexler and Greg Nuckols and Meadow. And I get to the point where it's just, okay, if the math is too hard for me to figure out, that means it's not that significant yet. So I don't have to worry about it that much. But that's the direction I'm leading my students in, is instead of it being like, well, okay, just what do you want to do? It's more so it's okay, how do you envision yourself continuing to learn over time? Because if right now you're already that person that's, okay, if I see something posted, I'm downloading, like, you're going to get a lot out of that. Or if that's a particular interest of you. If you're the person where it's like, oh, the last thing I want to do is sit down and read a bunch of papers, or dig through and try and find all the different papers that are available on this. Because there are some coaches that basically are just constantly, that's what they're doing. They're just constantly digging and digging. It's almost like we'll say a poor man's PhD program without the oversight, and that they're just like, okay, they're just specializing, they're diving in that one thing. And, I have some of those people. And then the number of young grad students now that I'm having conversations with, because I think there's a higher percentage of people in the field that are entrenched in the field personally. And so they obviously have more of an interest in what we're doing and more conversations on that. Okay. It's interesting to see like the actual similarities between those, but also, okay, you can get a leg up with the academic help here, but it's not impossible if you want to do it on your own. But the thing that you're missing, I think, is the checks and balances when you go and do it if you try and do it on your own, right? I mean, there's some people that are, they make me feel like I should be in the short bus kind of thing. Like I'm like, okay, man, like I thought I had an easy time in school, and I'm listening to you talk and thinking about where I was 20 years ago. And I'm like, yeah, you're going to understand this to a better degree than I ever am, even though I'm 20 years ahead of you. And so it's like, yeah, sure. If you're one of those people, then maybe you have complete freedom to go wherever you want, right? But if you struggle, that's kind of what I lean them towards.
Can I say one thing on that, Cass? Because I know we could probably move on from here, but I think a good way to look at it. So we have the avatar of the person who spent their entire career getting no experience, but managed to get a PhD in what seems like a related field of exercise or nutrition, right? And we've discussed how I personally I would discount their opinion over a trainer with 20 years of experience. And I think you would too. That person's critique of exercise or of coaching practice is just as likely to have issues as someone who has spent their entire time in the trenches and then comes across a study and then decides to critique the study confidently and put something out there. And I think that is what needs to be acknowledged, because right now there seems to be a bit of a double standard, right? It's like these pencil necks who don't have any experience talking to these IFBB pros like they don't know what they're doing. And yet you have someone who's never actually set foot in a lab. And that this could even be someone who completed like a coursework master's and was even taught to read research. They've actually never done research. And it's not that you might be right. That person's critique of the research could be correct, right? And there are some great people who I've learned from who are not actual researchers. Sometimes they've even actually been on a published paper, but they weren't actually conducting research, right? I'm not going to name names because I don't think it's important, but we have to at least acknowledge that if you spend your whole career training people and then you decide at some point, because you think you should be able to have this expertise, that I'm going to critique a research paper, you have to at least have the humility to say, I've actually never, I've never applied for an IRB. I've never figured out what I can put on my recruitment poster. I've never decided how long the washout's going to be before I bring someone in for a crossover. Just like, because you don't know what you don't know. So it's hard not to make that error, right? Just like the person who's the pure academic who's going, Mr. Bumstead, I think based upon Smith et al. 1998, that you'd be better suited to, some nutrition or training protocol. Those both are likely to be missing something. And I think we have to at least acknowledge that. And a large number of the voices right now who are, let's kick over the whole, garbage pile of science, are actually doing that while making that critique, which I think is quite hypocritical.
Mm-hmm. What are the artificial, we'll say, lines that you think there are right now? I mean, if you're in the TikTok space, there's the science-based bros or science-based trainers, which, I mean, technically they put science-based on every title of every piece of content that they do. So that, I mean, it's at least it's an accurate description in terms of the terminology they're using, even though I think we will agree that a lot of it doesn't fit what our definition of science-based would be. And then you talked about how it's kind of being viewed as, there's a scientific institution. And I don't think, at least from my observation, that most people think that there's like an ivory tower of science, right? I think really is that that's just the way of describing that there is like this clique of, and it's not the people that are it's mostly the people that are visible on social. It's the community of people there that are in some way, or at least it's perceived in some way, that they're controlling the conversation and who can have or be a part of the conversation. Those are the two kind of like things that I kind of see. It's like is where it's, here's a group of people that's being defined. Here's a group of people being defined. And then on the other side, there's, who are the bros? Like, what was the line around the bros? Because, and in preparation for this, I was just curious. So I looked up like, what is actual, like the definition of bro science, or the accepted one? And most of the examples where it's like, it's a derogatory term for whatever or whatnot. And I actually came across an article that referenced you, and I don't know how old it was, but it said, is that you stated that bro science was simply yesterday's truths. Like, this is on a bodybuilding.com article. I don't know if that's still the definition that you would stick by today or whatever, but I was like, that's different than all of the other ones that I'm seeing.
Well, Kass, let me ask you real quick.
Yeah.
Throw out to me, and this is just a little test, a water test case, one thing that you think is generally seen as bro science.
One thing that I think is generally seen as bro science in this instance, probably the shut up and lift would be the furthest in that.
How about a specific
category, right?
How about a specific thing that, say, an IFBB pro from the 90s might tell you to do, like things that are entrenched things that, no, you got to do this, bro. Like the kind of around the water cooler, there's bros. And they tell you these are the rules. Like, can you think of like the archetypal examples of a bro science claim?
Yeah, so I know where you're going from this, because it's like, all of it's gonna stem from some sort of scientific base. If I was trying to pick one that was like off of that, maybe it would be something like the points of flexion book or something like that. But even then, still, it's like, okay, we have evidence today on regional hypertrophy, so maybe there is something to training at all of those, right? Now, granted, the points of flexion book, I think, came out way before we had regional hypertrophy evidence in practice or whatnot, but those would be things where it's like, okay, regional hypertrophy is a thing, but it's not a topic that we know a lot about at this point in time. So does it maybe still exist in that field where we don't have enough evidence to make any scientific claim about it, that it still kind of fits in that category? So I do like that definition of, bro science are things that we believe are true, but we do not have we don't have strong convincing evidence that it is true other than the observations in practice and, whatever the stories of time.
Yeah,
That's so I would kind of share that. And so that would be one example there. It's like, oh yeah,
sure.
cool. You know, I wouldn't go as far as like Vince Stronda's, like a muscle has 70 sides or whatever he says,
Yeah.
but still then there's a paper out now that says that maybe we should classify the biceps as having 5 heads instead of 2. So who knows how many sides a muscle has these days.
Yeah, and my main point is that I think there was probably this misconception that bro science originated from bros, and I think some does. Some is just these observations, but I think a very large proportion of the myths that get entrenched and are hard to break actually originate from research. And because I don't like some people see anecdote and bro science as synonyms, and I think that's a huge mistake. And other people are not aware that many of the probably most archetypal examples of like bro science and say bodybuilding, which is kind of my main focus, did actually originate from like poorly done N of 6 papers in 1980 or 1990 that everyone was like, cool, that's the way it works. And don't it didn't actually even have an accompanying anecdote. Some of them
Mhm.
did, but not always. And I think that is just really fascinating because that is very different than the average, say, science bro on TikTok would think. They go like, oh, bro science bad, science good. Give me your PubMed reference. And, this bro science thing of eating all the time. It's like, bro, that came from an N of 1 case study on a boxer that was published
Mhm.
in a journal, like that you have to eat frequently to increase your metabolism. That's not, some bikini influencer trying to sell you fit tea that generated that. That was a peer reviewed publication.
Mm.
So, and I think then you go, oh, well, then science is trash. It's like, hold on, wait. What is science's role? It's to constantly update and review itself. And that has been critiqued. And the reason that we moved past that was also scientific publications, right?
Mhm.
Like just last week, I had someone express their frustration and wanting to kind of kick over the can of science because a new paper came out and said, actually, there's no upper limit to the muscle protein synthesis response to protein. And God damn it, there's this constant back and forth between the MPS response with protein. I can't follow it. Once you guys figure it out, you call me kind of thing. Like, but not even that. Like that actually is fine. Once you figure it out, call me because we eventually get there. But this idea that the flip-flopping of science is a problem. And I'm like, yo, we got a problem when science stops flip-flopping. When you stop seeing letters to the editor and researchers battling on Twitter, that's when we have a problem. Because now we have some kind of strange consensus that should not be there because we're no longer searching for questions and a better understanding of the truth, but we are having these just solidified answers that are not being questioned. And that's fundamentally not what research does. And I think that the issue on TikTok is they're looking for a new set of 10 commandments. It used to be, or currently is what Mike Mentzer said for whatever reason, he's hot. But whatever the current Mr. Olympia was, or Miss Olympia, or this guru, for whatever reason, I put someone up as the head of the cult of personality. If they say it, it's accurate. And I've just kind of supplanted that with science or the current science or whatever's new. And I think, like you said, you and I would not view that as evidence-based or science-based because it's fundamentally counter to the philosophy of it. But I find it, some of the anti-science movement is fixated on the fact that the information changes and goes back and forth, not realizing that they're in the midst of a discovery phase. Like vitamin D right now, for example, I'm very much overhauling my perspective on the recommendations I make around that. I'm definitely gonna end up saying things that disagreeing with Eric Helms of 2015 when I wrote the first edition of my books for 2019. And that's a feature, not a bug. And I see it presented as a bug sometimes. And I understand why it's frustrating, but it's a critically important aspect of the scientific process of revising,
Mhm. So I totally agree with you there. And I think like when it comes to the flip-flopping of things and things that are changing time, like one of my favorites is the squatting is bad for your knees. That
Mm.
was one that came from science. Is the expectation of science now, I think, is different then, oh, it's a discovery process. It's science needs to give me the definitive forever answer
Yes.
today. And the I think that part of the way that science is being talked about is one of the causes of that.
Yes.
Like, so much content wants to be made like so absolutist of like, oh, here it is. And then also then we'll say the discussions end up being very combative of it's almost like at a certain point, I feel like nobody can have an opinion anymore. Like,
Mm.
opinions are not allowed. If you better have a reference if you're going to say anything about an exercise or a topic. And I think that dichotomy has played into where it's just, well, okay, so if everything that's not science is not as valid, then science must be supremely valid. And therefore, my expectation of science now is that it is the finite absolute solution and it better not goddamn change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very excellent insight into it. And I think the interesting thing now is the interaction with social media and algorithms. I started this off, you asked me to summarize our podcast discussion on iron culture. And one of the things I said is that there are fundamental issues with the consumer that we could blame if we just wanted to be nihilistic. But they're not necessarily modifiable because they're features of of humans, right? And so it's kind of just an exercise in ranting rather than anything productive. However, algorithms are based upon the consumer preference. So when you start to be a content producer, an evidence-based content producer, a science-based content producer, and you are also going, well, to be successful, I want to leverage the algorithm, you are actually doing things that subvert your own message many times. So if I am rewarded by giving absolute stances on exercises, ranking them, top 10 lists, saying best, saying everything you knew is wrong, but I am actually doing them informed by research, your means, your basically the ends don't justify the means is what I want to get to.
Mhm.
Because you're basically saying science can provide absolute answers as to what is the best exercise for everyone. Now, the best content producers can do in this scenario is to hook you with that and then give you the context and the nuance in the content of the video. But if you look at the metrics on YouTube, you got like maybe 20% of people finishing a 10-minute video, right? If you look at the metrics on Instagram, you can have the exact same caption, but a more compelling image, and you'll get 20 times more clicks on it. Or you can say, and please listen to the more nuanced discussion on this podcast. And not only will you just only get 10% of people to listen to the podcast, even if everyone saw it, but you will see 10% of the engagement on that post just by saying the word platform or podcast or hinting, and Skynet realizing that you asked them to leave the platform of Instagram. You know, like, for example, I used to promote surveys, scientific published surveys that we were going to do. Like, hey, we want to know what coaches are doing. Hey, we want to know what bodybuilders are doing. Hey, we're conducting research on the menstrual cycle symptoms that resistance trained women experience, right? Please go to this link and take this survey. That was sufficient for me to get within one post 200 to 300 people taking a survey. Synergistic relationship, fantastic in 2019. 2023, I do that with nearly double the number of followers now, and I get 25% of that engagement. And the surveys have 80 people in it. Like, that's literally my PhD students are getting less participants in their studies because of how the algorithm has changed, right? So that is a reality that we're dealing with, in that we've acknowledged that the human condition is one where we're going to want to naturally confirm our biases. We're going to search for things that are easier to do rather than harder. So that means we need to get better and better at manipulating our environment and better at teaching, so that when people put forth less effort and are looking to confirm their biases, we have to combat that actively as educators, right? But if the algorithms are based upon reinforcing those human behaviors, and now we're playing slave to the algorithm, we're actually subverting our own mission. And I think that is a problem that like I could start railing against content producers, but I'm almost now railing against consumers because we're being consumed by the mechanisms at play in social media. And you have to be extremely diligent, attentive, and purposeful, and to some degree, choose to limit your own growth on social media in order to keep teaching in the most effective way that will reduce the occurrence of someone making logical fallacies, buying into their biases, or misunderstanding things. So that's another level. And I think sometimes I don't know what the balance is, and it also changes because, like I said, what even just 3-4 years ago, what happened on Instagram is different, and the same thing with YouTube than it is today. And unfortunately, these are the biggest platforms for getting information out as well, and they're not educational platforms; they're social media platforms.
So usually at least one day of our practical events, we have everybody stay and we play games and we eat, and everybody can ask me all the questions and we can have all the conversations that don't fit in the classroom. And social media and how to go about presenting the information and whatnot is always it's almost always one of the topics that comes up, especially because one of the messages that I'm trying to convey to my students is to you show respect to the highest level of nuance that you guys are learning here by not turning it into a 15-second clip or a 60-second reel. Like if it took you hours of online learning, coming here and doing it in practice and whatnot, what do you think you can deliver in 15 seconds or 60 seconds or whatnot? And so understand, hey, there's just some information that this platform is not useful for communicating, and odds are you're going to do more harm than good. And also, the person that you're like looking to draw in isn't the person that's looking for that level of nuance anyway. Like the
Yep.
client that's trying to find you is not trying to figure out what the most, lower seventh division of the costal pec does. Like that's not what they're looking for when they're trying to figure out, hey, I'm looking for a trainer. I wonder if they could tell me this thing, right? I wonder if they could tell me the internal moments of the biceps. Like that's not what the average client is looking for. So part of this is business advice of just like, hey, the
Yeah.
people that you're looking to attract shouldn't be looking for the same level of nuances that interest you, because those are your colleagues, not your clients. But then, when it comes to the more general stuff, it's a tough conversation for me to have, and I also don't know what the solution is. And this goes for me in my content creation as well, because it's very easy for me to be like, well, if everybody else is playing the game, then I might as well just do it too. Why let everybody else reap the success while I sit here and stand on my moral high horse and, don't benefit? Because if I don't do it, somebody else will. But then the purist in me is just like, well, what if everybody just refused to engage in this type of a conversation on these platforms? Would that then force a long-term change? Right? Would that be the way of like getting the consumer to
Social
have
media
to change?
walkout.
It'll never happen, because like I said, if you don't do it, somebody else is always going to take the easy win. And so, I sit more on the libertarian side of things, so I'm not like pro regulation of, oh, okay, this doesn't belong here, et cetera. So I have no idea what the solution is. So the best thing that I can offer is, hey, I provide education, and I try and make it so that people can get as deep as they want to. So it's okay if you're only willing to invest 15 seconds or 60 seconds into a particular topic, there's nothing that I can do for you. Like this is not right. There's nothing I can do that's going to make that. But if you are the person that's willing to spend the time or whatever, I can build my content so that the people that are going to stick around for 10 minutes or the hour or do the podcast and whatnot, it's like, okay, cool. I can help those. And so my kind of stance is, well, if that's basically who my long-term customers are, I'm going to gear my content towards that, even though, sure, could I have 4 or 5 times as many followers now if I did just like, hey, here's the 3 tips video or whatnot? And there definitely have been times where I've just been like, screw it, let's just do it. I mean, you know, very, very low hanging fruit. And I'm probably going to be somewhat of a hypocrite here soon because I'm thinking about just doing like reaction videos are like, that's the thing now. And reaction videos would be a very, very easy thing for us to do when it comes to talking about exercise and stuff like that. So
I think,
we're
and I think the
probably
question is what's the potential for harm, right?
Mhm.
And there are some innocuous strategies, right? Some of those things, like what are you reacting to? All the like you can, and I think to some degree you can leverage a little bit of drama without it necessarily being subversive to anything, and that's fine, like so long as like everyone involved is kind of given permission and they've talked about it. Cause like, I don't like to get broiled up. Like when someone leverages my name, it doesn't happen often because I'm not a very, like people know I won't really engage. But like when people try to create controversy with me, I don't like it. Like you're going to, like you're reducing my sleep. You're making me worry about this shit. I have to engage with you. It's human conflict. Like it's fun to watch and some people like to participate in it. I'm not one of them. I will like I'm not adverse to conflict though either. Like I will have hard conversations with people, but they have a purpose. They're facilitative. At the very least, I'm setting boundaries and letting people know that you can't treat me like that. But that doesn't occur publicly, right? So I think there are ways. It's not that you can't play the game at all. It's that you have to decide on what's the level of opting in to play because like you said, there is not going to be a social media walkout. And, if we kind of go back to your brief comment about being on the more libertarian side of things, whether you're more communitarian, I want more centrally regulated things, or you're libertarian, I think most people still agree that there needs to be some type of checks and balances, right? And whether those are coming from, the American Nutrition and Dietetic Society, which is actually technically not government anyway. So some of the things that libertarians say, like Facebook is Orwellian. It's a company. It's not Orwellian. You don't understand what you're saying. But anyway, like regulation and restriction of speech, it's almost impossible. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. But I do think there does need to be more and more people actively pointing out issues because we have fundamentally different problems now in 2024 than we do in 2010. When I started in this game, it was lack of access to information. People were like, I had never heard of a macronutrient. I don't know what you mean by energy balance. What do you mean I could eat a Snickers bar? Isn't that just going to make me fat? I'm like, well, what about the energy intake? What? Like those were things that like certain people knew it. They didn't understand it though. Now it is information overload and there is good information all the way down to bad information, all the way into that's actually misinformation. I'm happy categorizing it that to, that person is purposely giving disinformation because they have some motive to do so. And then those people are fighting with each other. And I think sometimes when we restrict ourselves to looking at the quote unquote evidence-based sector, which I will include the practitioners who are taking shots at science, many of them in that conversation, I think they should draw a circle around themselves instead of drawing that border. I think it's a huge issue. Like, this is an applied field. The role of someone with a PhD who's actively still involved with the university and the role of the trainer are different. They're not on a linear scale. You're not competing with the person who's conducting research. Your goal is to help one another, which we'll get back to. But to finish my point before I go off on that tangent, which I think is important, if we look closely at just the evidence-based quote unquote sector and including practitioners and scientists who see the value in research and putting it out there, we get into these quibbles with one another many times based upon not thinking they have played the game the way they should have. They're being too clickbaity, or they're criticizing me for being too clickbaity when they're not doing enough of it. They're limiting their own message. And it's a funny thing being someone who's actively involved in producing research and actively in the trenches, if you will, because sometimes I get critique from both sides. I don't get it as much as some other people I see, but if you go to like a very pure academic conference, like let's say ACSM, these are people who are dealing with patients and, you know, exercise physiologists. They're dealing with people. They're in the trenches of medicine and exercise for medicine on a day-to-day basis. So we can't draw these clear distinctions, but the reward mechanisms are not in place for them to be science communicators, and their entire income is derived from the production and dissemination of information rather than, say, coaching or something like that. So they don't have the reward mechanisms or really the time to be out there getting a social media profile. And like you said, many of the critiques are leveled at maybe the 0.1% of the scientific community who is also out there sharing on social media, and they become the avatar for science. That pisses off the people who are in science. You know, like like when someone says, and this is not to throw shade at Brad by any means, when someone says, like, you know, the godfather of all hypertrophy research, in Brad's case, that is like, if you look at the number of publications he has on what he does, at least from the applied sector, that's probably relatively accurate. But there's hundreds of hypertrophy researchers who have put a ton of work out there who the average person has not heard of unless they're actually in the academic field over the course of since like the 1990s and 1980s. Who, you know, some of the people who have read everything Brad Schoenfeld's ever written, maybe not the actual full text of the studies, who will actually, you know, finish their lives and leave this planet without ever knowing who those people were. And yeah, that rankles some of these humans' feathers. I've been in conversations with academics who are pure academics who aren't exactly happy with the esteem that some people are getting put upon them outside of the scientific community. Because the scientific community is a little bit siloed, which is a problem. The fact that there is a science communication industry, the fact that you and I have jobs, is because the typical journal article is behind a paywall and it's read by 6 other academics, presented at a conference that only other academics attend. And that has only gotten marginally better when we're talking about applied and translational research. Like, that's not an issue if we're talking about theoretical physics. Like, so long as NASA hears about it, we're okay. We're going to get that rocket to the moon. We don't need George to understand how to make a better bottle rocket to shoot it into Tom's backyard. Like, that's okay that is not being disseminated to the public. But if you're telling me that exercise science studies intended for the public to change behavior are not being read by the public, we've got a problem. And I think the fact that is a problem, which is getting better, is the whole reason why you and I exist and do what we do. Not the whole reason, but it's a large part of it. And it also explains our necessity. So I get frustrated with the pure scientists who get mad at those of us who have found a way to also be science communicators. But it absolutely impacts us. Like, I want to say it was the Carl Sagan effect. I might be getting this wrong, but there was some, I think, psychological or sociological research done, or it could have been a survey. I'm probably misrepresenting this, but I know the actual outcome is truthy. So this is, you know, ironic that I'm even bringing this up, but I don't know for sure what exactly I'm even bringing up. But I want to say that Carl Sagan's influence in his field was downplayed by his colleagues because he was a science communicator, you know, which is this ironic inversion of, say, someone who has a PhD, their contributions to exercise science being downplayed because they have the PhD. Like, it's happening on both sides, you know? So the people who are producing scientific content and are out there, they're getting the shots that we've already been talking about from, you know, people who are purely in the trenches who feel like maybe they're being too absolute, they're misrepresenting things, they're undervaluing anecdotal experience or traditional wisdom, et cetera, or they're preventing discussion if you don't have a PubMed reference. All of those things, valid critiques. And they're also getting it from the other side, and I've got it from both, of, oh, you're not a real scientist. You know, so it is this challenging thing where some of the arbitrary lines we draw around ourselves create a problem that needn't be there and actually doesn't represent what is really going on. Because there are literally tens of thousands of universities with graduate research programs where research is being conducted in sports nutrition or exercise science or sports science. And those exist across literally dozens of countries. And at each one of those institutions, there's anywhere between probably 5 to 100 master students and 1 to 50 PhD students working on that, depending upon how well funded, where they're located, and all that. There are I would, if I had to hazard a guess, between 2 to 10,000 articles in those collective fields that are coming out monthly, published across 2 to 500 independent journals. And I don't know 95% of people in my broader field. If we called me, because I sit across multiple, if I'm a sports nutrition, sports science, and exercise science guy, I don't know 95% of my people in my field. I know 95% of the people who publish actively in physique and strength sports science, right? But we're disconnected. And it is this, like I said, kind of like a cell-like structure where standard practice is based upon who wrote a methods paper and did it get through peer review and was it published in a visible journal? And when everyone looks at it, do we go, yeah, that makes sense? Or, oh shit, yeah, we probably shouldn't be doing that, right? After 5 years of debate. So yeah, the idea that like so some of these critiques are leveled at like the pinky thumb. Pinky thumb is not a thing. The pinky nail sticking out of the window of the car of what you kind of think is science and thinking, oh, that's science, when actually that car is in traffic and you're sitting in one of the other cars, right? Because the practitioners in an applied field are doing something that should be a direct handoff and exchange with the sports scientists. Because our goal as sports scientists, is how I categorize myself, is to see what's going on in practice, take from it, test some of these anecdotes, which are kind of these uncontrolled systems in the wild. Like, hey, I know when I do X plus Y plus Z1, A, B, 2, 3, 4, 5 until ad infinitum, I get success with my athletes. I think this is why that's happening, but I don't know for sure. And we go, okay, let me test that and check it out. And then we go feed back to them, here's what was related in our study. That's a lot of it. Because frankly, bodybuilders as a whole don't need exercise science to get big. They've been big. Now, some of them might be able to get bigger or bigger faster or bigger less with less harm. Same thing with powerlifters. There's been world champion powerlifters since before the NSCA existed, right? Not much before because of the timing of when it started. We'll say strength athletes. They've been strong people. How about that? So we're not a necessary component to advancing sport, right? But we could be a potential help. And that comes from us taking some of these observations and doing them in a more controlled environment, feeding back so that then the practitioner can be even more refined and precise and targeted in their approach. And sometimes, maybe slightly less often, there are things that we actually figure out that aren't being done in the trenches that we go, hey, try this on, and it either does or doesn't work, and it comes back to us, and then we refine it. But it's an exchange that's beneficial. And when we draw these borders around one another or each other or ourselves, depending upon kind of the social construct we're talking about, that's when we really run into problems. Screw exercise science. I'm just going to go on anecdote because it's so convoluted and messed up in these egos and personalities. I don't even want to deal with it. Now you've closed yourself off to a huge avenue for self-improvement. And I think previously what we had, which is changing, and some of the vestiges of this are creating some of the issues we see today, is this superiority kind of view in certain people in the scientific community of anecdotes are bro science. That is not useful. I don't need to consult with you. I don't need to do a survey of you. I know best. Let me do some research. But that is less common in applied fields, and it's much less common in, say, the last decade. And it's more common that you're seeing people with a more participation-based focus, which is, I think, a very positive thing in the movement like open science. I think that's incredibly important. Us consulting people in the trenches say, hey, this is what we're trying to do in the lab. Does that make sense? So it needs to be synergistic because it is not a top-down hierarchy. It's not that the PhD is better than the personal trainer. They're literally lateral to one another and hopefully should be helping one another, which is why it's so damaging to draw circles around in the trenches versus in science, and why there needs to be the communication between the two. And when that communication breaks down, I think we need to level that issue at the people doing it, the individuals, not science as this false institution that we see it as, because that's just like, if you want to poison the well in the village, okay, but we all live in the village and we all need water. So maybe we don't throw shade at like empirical, like knowledge determination, because I've heard that thing's pretty good.
You think it's tough to separate the influencers of an industry from the industry as a whole now because of how prominent their exposure is, right? So the effect of the science communicators versus most of the people that aren't active on these platforms, to me, I see that as that's the same thing that we see with just an influencer and in anything. And it is usually often the person that's just making content about the work rather than doing the work. And I think this is a transition I've seen a lot of people go through where they maybe on the coaching side, maybe they've been very successful coaches and once they reach a certain level of influence, they realize that like through financial means or what just lifestyle, whatever it is, they realize just switching to purely taking the influencer role is, there's a lot more success to that in certain avenues. And, cool. Like you could be the best in your field as a coach, but somebody that has a high degree of influence and followers is likely going to be the person that's interviewed on the podcast and on the magazine and whatever. So I think that that's happening across the board, both in science, but also just in coaching and pretty much probably every industry that you can think of. And so I think, yeah, putting lines around the two industry, like our two teams, because it's really just the talking heads of the two that kind of are getting into the conflict. And I think like part of what I see is there tends to be like this reinforcement of, hey, let me get all of these people behind me and try and other the other thing. And so I think it's, whatever shit rolls downhill, sort of thing where it's just like, okay, so much of the audience is being influenced by just the disagreements or maybe the interpersonal conflicts at the top. And then that context gets lost. And now it's not, oh, this person, I don't like their particular perspective. It's now, I don't like the entire field that they were a representative of. And oftentimes not even that good of a representative in some instances.
Absolutely. And it's really only one step away from an ad hominem when you think about it, right? So you're not willing to maybe call out the person, or maybe you're trying to even to be charitable. Maybe you're going, I don't want to do an ad hominem attack, but man, I'm pissed about this and I don't like it and I'm seeing it. So I'm going to take a shot at bro science. I'm going to take a shot at the bros or IFBB pro or bodybuilders. Man, I get it from all angles, Cass. I'm a very put upon, oppressed person. I don't know. Look how hard my life is, right? I'm chilling on a Saturday morning talking to you about bodybuilding. No, but in all seriousness, like I've ran into dietitians who see issues with disordered eating, body image, and unhealthy relationships with food. And they kind of see bodybuilding as like the poster thing that causes that and the influence on the industry. So bodybuilding is bad, So they don't call out specific bodybuilders necessarily because they don't want to do that or a specific issue, but they'll attack the whole thing. They'll other it, which is a great way of putting it. And I think the othering from the part of the scientific community that sometimes is anti-anecdote, anti-bro science, anti-anything that, doesn't align with their conception of what science is, has led to some of this pendulum swing back to where now there's this othering of scientists. Like I saw a very ironic post, and I'll just say the person because that's what they said. Jordan Shallow had this video where he was talking about how it feels like researchers, or it's gotten to the point where anyone who is big is actually looked down upon because they're big. Kind of the same comment I was making about how if you just having a PhD makes you, like less good at your job. And then he made a little comment, and an angry one. So maybe he doesn't hold this belief every day of the week, but at least in the moment he typed it out on his phone, he did. He said, those who can't do research. And of course it gets a huge eye roll out of me. I'm like, get the fuck out of here. It's a ridiculous claim. It's probably an emotional claim. Maybe he believes it. Fine. Sure. I think he's wrong. I disagree and I'm allowed to. But but he also his Instagram handle is like the muscle doc or something like that. So it's on one hand leveraging credentials and a scientific, maybe, credential, and then like getting mad about it on the other. but probably because he felt similarly to some of the people who are attacking science at some point, where I'm not allowed to have an opinion because I can't put a citation after it, right?
Yeah.
And I think like that is othering, and I don't think it's helpful. And I think it goes both ways. The othering of the bro and the othering of the researcher, when ideally we're on the same team, is a big part of the problem. And like you said, many times, almost I would say most of the time, in neither case do they represent all trainers, all bodybuilders, or all researchers. And there's also not a consensus group that has a homogenous view and that they're all a monolith among bodybuilders, researchers, or trainers. So I almost wish we could have some kind of social contract where I won't take shots at bro science if you don't take shots at science. And maybe we can just deal with the specific claim that's being made and not the group that you associate with that claim. Because it is, again, even if you're trying to do the good non-logical fallacy thing, an ad hominem attack is obviously a logical fallacy. An ad hominem against a group is pretty much the same thing. So I think that's, it would be nice if we can make that social contract, but since we aren't actually a group, we can't make an agreement to not label the other group because these groups are just artificial constructs.
When I'm trying to think of what are the paths forward to this, and one of the things is I just feel like there's such a lack of appreciation from both sides for the contribution, right? I think that a lot of people in the practice take for granted the stuff that's common knowledge now and how much of that is built on the foundational sciences. And they just look at, well, the latest meta-analysis on volume or whatever didn't radically change the way I'm going to coach people, therefore not useful. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but you probably made 100 decisions based off of foundational sciences in the last 3 clients that you worked with, or whatever it may be. And then likewise, from the research side of thing, especially it seems that there's more and more young people from the scientific community that are really leveraging and utilizing these platforms, probably just because they're the age group that's more interested in it as well. But
not on TikTok.
Like sometimes it comes off as, oh, science discovered this, or sometimes the people that are involved are like, oh, look what we found out. And I think sometimes from the field where it's like, oh, we've been doing this for X amount of years, that rubs them the wrong way of being like, okay, like when this was our idea, it was like, well, that's bro science. And it's looked at as you're like, oh, you don't have anything. And then as soon as it meets that stamp of approval, it's like, wait, now we don't get credit for all like being the first ones to try this. Cause I think in both instances, it's like, look, you guys are totally discounting the cross benefits that come from that. And that's likely a personal ego thing on both sides, but it just kind of festers, I think, over time between the communities. And so I don't know if a few of the talking heads would start taking the stance of saying, like, yeah, cool. Like, we know this now, but, the reason that we investigated in this first place is because these guys were trying it here or whatnot, and vice versa. It's like, you take somebody like one of them, the meme that we talked about was that meme that Milo and Pac made of trained by JP, right? And I thought that was such a funny clash, right? Because when I think of science, I'm like, okay, if I know JP is a guy who is meticulous with his logbooking, he applies the scientific method in his training. So the irony of the argument, like, was like the biggest thing. I'm like, okay, so clearly there's a huge cultural divide here, even though there's not much of a technical difference. If you were to look at how he approaches his coaching, how he approaches his training, you'd be like, this is as scientific of an approach as you could take, especially down to an N of 1 level. Like, it's very data driven, right? But then on the other side, because now there's these false divides, it's like, oh yeah, well, yeah, science is just a bunch of skinny people and untrained people that can't do this and whatnot. And I think if we could shift that to being like, oh, hey, I track all this data, but the reason that I know how to use it, the reason I'm like, okay, this exercise isn't staling out and I choose this other one, like these aren't like decisions that are just like, I just go back and use my Ouija board or roll the dice to figure out what I'm going to do. I'm still applying both a scientific method in terms of like, well, what's making progress and what's not, and trying to control these variables, but then also relying on those to then make the decisions of when to change, what to change, etc. And then also be like, yeah, but there are limitations to what I can get. I can't tell somebody
Yes.
exactly what number of sets to do based off of the research. But what I can do is use everything that I have, both from an experience and a scientific perspective, to decide, hey, maybe we should try more. Or maybe this is a sign that we're doing too much. It's not this binary of, and I think you critiqued the experiment of, oh, if we took all the data and we threw it into a supercomputer or whatnot. So I tried to re-leverage that with my conversation with Alex is, no, we wouldn't expect it to give us like the answer and like, here's a convergent point of the best program. But what it would do is it would improve the algorithm that we would have for each individual. You'd be able to be like, okay, put all this person's data in there. And now the algorithm for the decisions that we're going to make for them would get substantially better. Like that's
Yep.
to me how I would see, that going. And I think that's what is happening now. It's just coaches are just doing the algorithm in their head for the most part, right? Who knows what's going to change? Maybe Neuralink's going to be doing it for us in the future, or whatever, AI or
yeah, exactly. We get more and more app-based tools that help us see patterns better, right? So we know the inputs that are better, which is of course based on data science. But I think, not that this is a solution, and we can get to maybe our attempts at fixing the world together. But I think to understand why that occurs sometimes from the scientist down onto the practitioner is that the mindset and the values of what you get taught as a researcher is, how do I determine causation? How do I bring things down to being reductionist and then bring them back in? And sometimes I'm not very good at doing that. As applied researcher, that's something I get taught. Like there's a difference between ecological validity and internal validity, right? And a lot of things don't survive. And how many times have we made errors? The hormone hypothesis, over extrapolating on muscle protein synthesis, EMG, et cetera. The list goes on, right? When we reduce something down in a dynamical system to one variable, that often will not represent even the thing we think it is supposed to be representing. Anyway, point being, when you get trained in that way, you'll look out on the sea of anecdotes. And I've talked about this. You'll see Ronnie Coleman seemingly intuitively doing lengthened partial shoulder presses. But you'll also see someone else saying, do peak contraction training on lateral raises because you really feel it right here, or hamstring curl. And you apply an equal thing to them. It's all anecdote. There's not consensus in the field. So we need to come in and help you get consensus. And then once we find consensus, it may feel like there's ownership of that. And the person, let's say Ronnie Coleman was a content producer and he was, or let's just say you. Actually, we'll make this real personal because I think it humanizes it, because you're right here. If you have been talking based upon biomechanical principles, but not actually having like an RCT to say you should train in this way, but saying, this makes a lot of sense. I'm also observing it in practice. And it seems like training and biasing things at longer muscle lengths is enhancing hypertrophy reliably in my clients. And even when they are plateaued and they're already well trained. And, now lengthened partials is just the domain of people who've done research on it. What the hell? And I think the reason that occurs is because when someone is heavily in the research sector, or at least for a period, the anecdotes don't necessarily get differentiated. And there is absolutely a delineation between anecdotes. There's an anecdote of the 17-year-old dude who started taking a random bullshit supplement and working out at the same time. And he was like, dude, I got jacked off Mega Grow. And it's like, it's his own personal experience. And he forgot that he started lifting. Maybe that's why he grew, not Mega Grow, all the way up to someone who has, a spreadsheet that would shut down any kind of computer built in 2018 or earlier because there's so much data in it and correlations being done and all that. And 10 years of client history, who's assisted by AI devices and data science, like we talked about, but doesn't have an RCT. Those are both technically anecdotal. And a controlled observational trial is actually no different, except it got published and went through peer review, than that last quality of anecdote. So like they're on this hierarchical pyramid of evidence quality, but the distinction between the, observational evidence and high quality anecdotes from someone who's actually taking notes and analyzing it is the difference between a preprint that hasn't gone through peer review and has been written down, and what's happening in many like sports scientists' offices, and a lot of researchers, they get hired to go do this stuff on a team. Like I have a family friend who is a data analyst for an MLB professional team. They're doing sports science every single day. They're not publishing it, but 100% they're doing sports science, and they're looking at correlations, and they're changing one thing and all that. And, we don't have an MLB professional team salary, but you and I, when we work with clients for EDMJ and One, a lot of different good coaching companies I can think of, JP, you mentioned, I don't have intimate knowledge of how he works. If you're doing a data-driven approach, it's really not that different. But once you are in kind of the sphere of academia, your natural inclination is to go, right, there's a sea of anecdotes. There's not a consensus. So we need research to step in and do it. And while I think that is true, because without actual empirical testing, we can't know for sure that something is the actual way it really works. I think it is valuable to acknowledge, and even the hypotheses on the front end, that this is the whole reason we're investigating it in the first place. And that's a much more common thing in translational research, but it's newer and it's less common in the more mechanistic side of things. So and I really swear I'm not trying to boost myself up and say I'm the perfect example of this, but it is just because I've sat in both worlds. Like if you read the introduction to my master's thesis, I basically say, hey, there are the population guidelines for protein. There's the sports nutritionist ranges for protein. And there's bodybuilders observing that really high protein diets seem to be effective. And we can't really, and they're not all on the exact same page in the trenches. How do we figure out what's an appropriate protein intake? And maybe this is being influenced by the unique circumstances of contest prep because of X, Y, and Z reasons. So I am kind of used to defaulting to, let's figure out where there's these unresolved topics that we need a more refined method of figuring out knowledge. But then, in my conclusions, I say, hey, bodybuilders maybe went a little too high, in their protein intakes, but there's a rationale for it. And a lot of what we were basing protein intakes on was not actually measuring the thing we care about. Nitrogen balance is not muscle thickness, right? So perhaps we should do these randomized controlled trials. Maybe we should meta-analyze it. And oh, wait, there's no harm of going too high, which makes sense. That barrier of too high of a protein diet that an RD would wag their finger at you for, what's the downside? At a certain point, it can eat into your carbohydrates and fat, but let's talk about that. So for translational research, it should be built in. It should be, we're addressing something for the consumer of it. And I think a really, really important perspective that I would say is more common than perhaps the people critiquing quote unquote science realize, but does need to become even more common in the scientific community. And I view it this way, and I viewed it this way from the start, is that once you go from being a consumer or reader or a critiquer of science or a user of science in your practice or for yourself as an athlete or coach, and you go from deciding I'm actually going to do a degree and produce research or be a researcher, a large portion of that motivation needs to be altruistic. Because it's a poor career choice. I'll tell you what, there's grant money in it, but it doesn't go in your pocket. And certainly the grants are not going to be big for bodybuilding science. So when you decide I'm going to do a master's by research and then a PhD by research, and then I'm going to be in an exercise science or sports nutrition lab, by far you need to realize, and I think many do, to be honest, that's service. We're actually trying to help. So while it feels shitty to be cast, not getting acknowledged for having the anecdote that was actually based upon, observational data and theory, that, dude, I've been doing this for 10 years and now you act like you have ownership for it. It also sucks to spend a decade committing to something that is an act of service to try to help your community, and then to be treated like you're not even part of the community, and that what you're doing is actively taking away from it, and maybe even destroying someone's gains, like some titles would say.
Mhm.
And I don't think either one of those is necessarily intentional. They come from a misunderstanding of how things operate. I don't think someone critiquing science really realizes what it is to be an applied translational sports scientist and what goes into it, which is why I've spent so much time on that. And I also don't think the entrenched person in the academia who is not giving credit to one of the anecdotes is doing that on purpose, because they've kind of put this broad brush on, like, everyone out in the trenches is just doing anecdote things, which is not fair or an accurate representation. And like I said, some anecdotes are far more powerful than others. So I agree with you. And that whole tirade was just to explain why it happens on both sides, not to necessarily fix it. But I hope that helps people understand kind of the root of why we see things like that.
So when are we getting the Netflix special of like the behind the scenes exercise scientist, you know,
Mm.
so that everybody can be informed of all of the struggles? I
To
think
be
that's
honest, the funny thing is that some of the things that people want as far as the transparency, like, can I see videos of these people? I want to see how they're training and are they really going to failure? The barriers are in place are largely ethical and logistical. Like, I can tell you straight up that 99% of ethics boards would have a huge issue with that,
Mhm.
And there is a movement, though, and it is actually within science to, like, for example, just the act of sharing all of your participant level data is an uphill battle for people in research right now.
Yep.
Not only from the ethics boards themselves, because we want to be able to provide de-anonymized, anonymized data, and confidentiality participants is the ideal. But if I want to do a research study on, let's say, nationally qualified powerlifters in New Zealand, and I give you their squat, bench, deadlift, height, weight, and BMI, you can probably figure out who they are. So, boom, flagged. I have an issue there, right? I can only provide group means. If I want to provide you even a silhouette of somebody and it's a high level athlete, shit. Like honestly, if you gave me the silhouette of Lane Norton squatting, I know it was Lane Norton. You know what I'm saying? Like, especially when we're dealing with unique outlier performances, elite level athletes, like, there's a case study. Who could it be on of Ray Williams, that everyone now knows as Ray Williams, showing his body composition? But it's like this anonymous super heavyweight world champion powerlifter who weighs 180 kilos and squats over 1,000 pounds. Like, who else could it fucking be? So we run into these issues in sports science with data sharing, ethics and data sharing is an evolving field as well, where absolutely some of the things that have been suggested to us by people in the trenches and who want to see this additional transparency, we would love to do, but it's not like we haven't thought about it. It's that there are barriers in place, and I think it will change, and there's going to be creative solutions, and especially just simply getting permission in a way that could not be perceived as coercion is like the lowest hanging fruit. But you would be surprised at what an ethics board considers a potential for coercion versus any, what I would argue, reasonable, rational human.
Yeah.
And that's a shot
I
of
was
ethics board. But
I was
sorry.
actually having this conversation with Daniel Plotkin after we were talking about the squat hip thrust study, and we were going over possible solutions to get the squat anthropomorphics and whatnot out there. And I was really surprised at how many things probably still wouldn't be acceptable, you know? And I'm like, well, so I'll go ahead and criticize the ethics board for you, because I'm like, that's ridiculous. And I don't know, maybe because a lot of people, I mean, before I got all this lab equipment or whatnot, I was having this conversation with Ben House of like, hey, maybe the future to get past these things is just us with means, just deciding to, hey, I'm just going to run the labs here where there are no regulations. I mean, you can argue that that's a limitation itself too, but it is nice that, like, okay, cool. If I do EMG on somebody, I don't have any problem with that. I have their permission to just post the video up there so you can see the technique and the form or whatever. Same thing if we're doing Moxie data or forces or whatever. It's like, it's right there, and that was basically the only way that I was going to do it, knowing that, okay, I need to have full transparency, knowing the criticisms that I would get. It's
Yep.
like, okay, that's the only way to do it. So I don't know if that's the temporary solution or if there is any
I think
way
it's
of
viable.
Yeah.
I think there's nothing, I'm going to say there's nothing wrong with it, and then I'm going to critique it. And what I mean by that is that that would be a good thing to produce. It would have limitations. Like we wouldn't have necessarily the same, I mean, it could have peer review, right? If you get a consult
There's
with
no
a
reason
sports
it couldn't.
scientist who's an expert, who's there, and it's open, it's transparent. There's no reason everything has to be locked behind the journal's way of doing things. And that's basically the open science movement. I mean, I can't sit here and say I'm a fan of open science and I'm a fan of preprints and go, no, you're not allowed to do, you know, an unpeer reviewed publication on your own of data and in-house. Like, absolutely not. And like, what if you went through the process of actually recruiting enough people that you had statistical power, but you just simply didn't go through a journal? I think that's great. I think that'd be fantastic. And we'd be missing out on relatively minor things that were embedded into the scientific institution of publication, or I should say procedures. But I think it would be worth it. And I think the more of that occurs, the more likely we are to see changes in some of those barriers to having more transparent stuff. But that, honestly, that fight is being fought very hard from within the scientific community right now. And I think that's something that people should be aware of, is that everything that people bring up about transparency issues, like I want to know these people are doing it. People like James Steele are fighting, have been fighting their whole career for things like that. And he and many others doing it are scientists within their own field. So it's, if you want to hear some people giving pushback on ethics boards, you don't need to search for the coaches. Like, that is every sports scientist, anyone who has to apply to it, for sure.
If you don't know any better, it's very easy to attribute it and just be like, oh, these people are just lazy or ignorant, and that's why we're not getting the
deceptive
data that
even.
we would like to have, right? Yeah. Yep. So I do think I think that's an important thing to be kind of pushing out there, because I do think transparency is something that would help kind of bring things, like the more there can be transparency, I think the better, because I think being proactive, I mean, if you're putting out a paper, you probably already know what the majority of the critiques are going to be from social media or whatever. Like, so it's like, even if it's just being upfront with, hey, we would love to do this, but it's not there or whatnot, like, and proactively mentioning it rather than just dismissing it and waiting for then somebody to post up their review and be like, oh, this is a garbage study because you didn't see this. And we have no idea what this is, you know, et cetera. Right. And that's always something that I'm struggling with when, like, on my side of things, when I'm trying to portray what I wish we had versus what we actually have. And it's like, okay, this isn't a critique of the researchers, but it is a critique of the research in terms of the data set that we have and our ability to interpret it, right? Because
It's a
like,
discussion
okay,
of the limitations, right? At the very least.
So,
no, I agree, man.
For you.
Go ahead.
Question for you when it comes to people that are currently publishing research, but they're in the content creation space. And this is something I've just, you know, it just hit me recently. I was reading a paper and then I got down to the conflicts of interest, and it was like, like none listed. And I was like, this is interesting to me, because based off of the context of the paper, I'm like, there is a direct relationship between what, like, this paper and what it says, and basically the branding of these content creators, right? And I'm curious what you think there is. Does that need to be a thing that's starting to show up in the conflicts of interest? Because we have enough people that are participating in both research and content creation, especially those that are creating a brand around a methodology or principles or concepts. And it's like, you know, it's very easy to then, you know, be reading that and be like, is this a biased perspective because it suits that person I feel like that's an area that like is fairly new to the space, and I
Mhm.
haven't seen mentioned as a conflict of interest, but I know some of these people are making very good business off of just simply talking about these or reinforcing these topics on social media platforms. And I think that's an area we need to catch up on, and that's a transparency that I would like to see as well.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So I will answer by providing more perspective on this because I think it's helpful. So, for example, when you get listed as an author on a paper in the Journal of Strength Conditioning and Research, you get a automated message that asks you basically this robust questionnaire on whether or not you have a conflict of interest. And it's no surprise that this popped up after they got sued by CrossFit. But the timing is just convenient, right? The questionnaire is entirely related to financial relationships. Did you receive any funding for travel, producing the work? Is this your author's own work? Are there any off-label prescription drug use? Did your spouse get paid? Did you get even an honorarium to speak on this topic? Were you flown out to a conference? And it's quite robust. And someone in the instance you're talking about would, based on the questions, declare they had no conflict of interest. And that's because the general conception we have in academia right now is there a financial conflict of interest with relatively clear bounding? What you're talking about, though, is interesting because I think it is a modern problem. And the other thing I will answer with you is not in every publication I do, but a larger and larger percentage, especially when it's something like a review or a position stand. I've been saying this. So this is actually from a paper that we published. And actually, you can find this basically in several papers that we've published. If you scroll all the way down to the conflict of interest section at the end, for the journals that have it, not all of them do. Let's see, here we have the author contributions, what each one of us did, and then the acknowledgments, thank you for doing this. And then under the conflict of interest, I have Eric Helms is a writer in the fitness industry, but no known companies will benefit from the results of the present study. So this is something I've started to do because I agree with you. Like I financially benefit or benefit in some way in terms of prestige or exposure by just because I sell information. So now I see it much more of a problem if I had like a training method rather than like, 'cause for example, like I'm trying to think like, okay, where's my income from? I'm the science officer for 3DMJ, so providing training, but there's not a 3DMJ method, right? Each one of the coaches does their best, and we believe that we are taking an individualized approach. There's mass. It's not the low carb, monthly research review where we review all the research that tells you that low carb is good. It's like here's the stuff that came out that's relevant to this population, and here's our best take on it. Now, of course, our biases are baked into those interpretations, but bias isn't the same thing as conflict of interest. There's the muscle and strength pyramids, which I guess if something subverted the relationship I see between the importance of exercise selection, volume intensity, et cetera, like maybe you could say that would be a conflict of interest for me. Like I wouldn't, like if someone said, hey, supplements are more important than energy balance. And if I, published a letter to the editor, I would probably have to declare a financial conflict of interest because I have a book that's based upon the premise that that's not the case. So personally, the types of things I benefit from and the products I'm associated with, I rarely have to declare a financial conflict of interest. And every time I do, it's actually related to something in academia, like RP gave us money to fund the study, or Legion Athletics gave us money to fund the study. And I state that as a financial conflict of interest. But lately, just because of what you've said, I've just acknowledged like, hey guys, I write in the fitness industry. I exist. I make money in the fitness industry. And I don't know if that's a conflict of interest, but I'm just going to be transparent and say it because, there's people who think like big volume is a thing now, right?
Mhm.
So I do think there is something to be said for that, but I think it's also worth acknowledging that, like, let's say someone has an area of study that they did their PhD on, and they honestly come by the belief that this is an effective way that people should be training, and it's relatively universally applicable to, say, bodybuilding. And I publish papers in support of that. And I then make content and write books about that specific topic. I'm not sure. I mean, that can be a financial conflict of interest, but at the same time, that is also a bias that someone comes relatively honestly by, you know? And we change our perception of what's a conflict of interest based upon how solidified a data set is and how the data was come by. Like, I think people would struggle to ask a registered dietitian to like, if they wrote a diet book that was largely based around energy balance, right? And they positioned that as the main thing, right? I don't think anyone would expect that dietitian, if they were part of a Kevin Hall study that proved using a metabolic ward that energy balance was what was driving, changes in body mass or body tissue, to put a conflict of interest, say, hey, I wrote a diet book that said energy balance is actually the central governing factor for whether someone loses body fat. But that's kind of what we're saying here, that maybe they should. And I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that, because I don't think a conflict of interest and a bias are the same thing. And I do think we need to have a pretty clear line between those two.
Going back to, like, how do we, what does the least harm? Do you think we should be more proactive? Like, hey, let's get out in front and over declare versus not declare and have the possible scrutiny? Because that's kind of where I would lead.
100%. And there are some specific researchers I know who have relatively benign conflict of interest, who don't want to mention it because they think it'll increase the perception that they're biased. And I think it's actually the opposite. And several times what's happened in these instances is it comes out and then it looks like they hit it, and then the person questions their integrity. Like, Stu Phillips had a big blow up online related to this a while ago. And I fully believe that Stu Phillips does not have any true conflict of interest that's impacting his research, yet he wasn't putting it out there. Now he does. And there was this blow up on Twitter. And I'm just like, man, if you'd just been overly transparent and not kind of what I guess is a fear-based decision, if I don't want to tarnish my reputation, it's like, that's not tarnishing your reputation. It's being transparent and saying, here's the way everything goes. A parallel to this is that I will occasionally get the whole natty or not thing. Anybody who has a physique and claims natty will get that. And then they'll even link back to something I said in like 2005 on the bodybuilding.com forums. Like, Eric took pro hormones back then. And I'm like, and who told you that? It wasn't a secret. It was me. Like, it always disarms it immediately. I'm very transparent about the fact that when I was in my early 20s, I had a brief stint in the mid 2000s, like many of us did, because they were available on over-the-counter GNC, of taking like Andro or Superdrol for weeks. And I actively said, hey, when and by what natural organizations do I qualify for competition? I want to follow the rules. But imagine if I tried to hide that, never talked about it, hid it, and then it came out that someone, scraped an old server and old internet things, and it popped up in 2019. It would destroy my reputation, even though I'd actually followed the rules for all the natural organizations and I'd been transparent about it. I'd called up the NGA, I'd emailed the INBA, I'd spoken to INBF promoters, and I diligently made sure that I followed the rules. Like, that's the type of thing that I am not at risk for, because I've always been transparent about it. And the only reason anybody knows that I took pro hormones is because I've been telling them and I want to make sure I'm not breaking the rules, right?
Mm.
So I think that is a very human thing to do. If you look internally and you go, look, I don't have a conflict of interest, but it might look that way. Well, I don't want to give people, I'm going to keep that quiet. I think it is more likely to do harm than good. So I totally agree with you. You should be overly transparent, if anything.
I agree. So the science-based thing, like we started this was like evidence-based, has now become science-based. Since we're about running out of time, to do something maybe a little fun, maybe a little annoying, I wanted to read
That's how I
some.
would describe you in
Okay.
general. Maybe a little
Yeah.
fun, but maybe a little annoying. That's Cat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to read you some titles and just give you like I'm a fan or not a fan of how the language is being used in this, right? You good with that?
Yeah. And you're going to get a lot of not a fans. I can already
All
tell
right.
you.
Okay. All right. And I've included some in here that I actually am a fan here
Okay.
at the end too. So it'll be interesting to see if we agree there as well. Because I don't think like you just can't use science in a title like by any
Sure.
means, right? So okay. So what are the best blank exercises science based?
I am neutral on that
Neutral on
because
that one?
I do think we're getting to the point where well, no, actually, no, I'm in negative because best exercises almost assumes that everyone does exercises for the same thing. And how many
Mhm.
times have Olympic lifters and bodybuilders fought about how to squat, right? So not a fan.
Yeah, I agree too. Too much individual variability and oftentimes not as specific, right? Especially it's like, okay,
Lacking a
right.
goal is
Yeah.
my not a
Quads,
fan
which
for it.
one, right? But it usually never gets down to the specificity of the tissue, the specificity of the goal, and who the individual is, et cetera. Cool. We agree there. All right. Not that we need to agree on all these anyway. All right. Scientifically proven X workout.
Definitely not for the whole workout. That, not a fan.
Yeah. Right. And then similarly, this is basically the same thing, but it's like the evidence-based blank workout, right? I think I think it's impossible when you come down to the workout thing, right? I mean, the more granular we get, the more we can be like, okay, yeah, we have principles that support this. But okay.
Sure.
All right. Optimal blank training according to science or backed by science.
Like optimal back training, optimal squat training, something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, science can't tell you what's optimal, so I'm also not a fan. I will say that this entire category is playing the algorithm game, and then potentially, once you get to the meat of the video, delivering the nuance.
Mhm.
So there are titles that we've used for Iron Culture that I'm not a fan of, but then I know like it's a podcast, they're going to listen.
Yeah.
So this isn't an indictment saying the person shouldn't do it, but the titles in a vacuum, yeah, if that's all we're gonna get, not a fan.
Yeah. I would say in large, I am not satisfied with the content that follows the titles, right? That's where I currently sit. Okay. Best and worst exercises ranked with science.
Definitely not a fan because for what? If you were to and you know, the defense here is let's say the person only makes hypertrophy or strength content,
Mhm.
maybe it gets a little better. So I think it is I Jeremy, Jeff, Milo, Pack, don't at me for me saying I don't like these things but I mean,
Yeah.
I get it. This is kinda going back to that prior point, like, you have to play the game to some degree, and I'm not sure
Mhm.
where to draw the line in the sand, but yeah, the title's in a vacuum, not a fan of almost any of it.
Yeah. Potentially the worst one I think on here, the perfect blank workout according to science.
Yeah,
Not
that's
even
by
best, but
far yeah,
perfect.
perfect. I love it. It gets no better.
All right. The most scientific way to train blank. So probably body part is what you'd put in there.
I mean, that's better.
Yeah, that
That's better.
one's yeah.
Yeah,
I'm kind of neutral on, right? And again, it would really
yeah.
depend on what falls, right? So like kind of, cheating here, but here's the three that I find or that I think that are the best out of the examples I could pull. One was basically science applied, X training, right? Like I
Love it.
like that. Like, oh, cool. We're taking and we're applying it, but it's not saying that science says this.
Yep. I like it.
That one gets an approval. Um,
Absolutely.
very almost like a synonym here, but the other one was science informed
Mhm.
blank workout, right?
Yeah.
And then this one is like the best blank science explained. Right. And I'm like, okay, sure. I don't think that there's anything wrong with having an opinion on, or a
Mhm.
hierarchy of those, and then going through your like that to me seems
A
like
scientific
somebody's going to give me
explanation.
their opinion and give you an
Mm.
explanation. So I'm like, okay, yeah, like that one seems more right.
Yeah, nothing fundamentally wrong with that.
Okay.
It depends on what actually, I think the blank there is very important. Because if it's
Mm-hmm.
like the best workout science explain, I'm like, that's science can't explain that. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
it would need to be what the blank is for me to give it the full thumbs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is there's an infinite number of iterations
100%.
here or whatever. And I left the blank out there just so it would be slightly harder for somebody just to like literally type it in Google and find, oh, who posted that exact title. It's not a huge secret for a bunch of them, but
No.
you know,
And they're
yeah.
channels I've been featured on and people I
Mhm.
collaborate with, and people I think do good work in the industry too. And I think, like I said earlier, I think I have stepped away from critiquing the way people draw a line in the sand with how much clickbait, how much algorithm playing they have to do when they're ultimately trying to deliver good information that I agree with in most, which is why it's almost a meme, me saying neutral to positive, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's also okay for content creators to get that wrong and then change, because it's not an easy game. And like I recently had Lane Norton on Iron Culture, and it basically told him like there was a time when I thought the way you tried to, you know, debunk pseudoscience was counterproductive, and I disliked it and I judged it. And these days, I think we have very different problems, and I'm seeing you've actually had a pretty positive impact. Like I haven't been on Joe Rogan, and no, you don't deliver the level of nuance, and no, you're not devoid of ad hominem attacks sometimes, and yes, you do make, broad distinctions, but at the same time, like, you've also probably prevented a lot of people from going down some shitty rabbit holes that I haven't been able to impact, and I've had to reflect and go, "Well, I'm probably more useful to other practitioners who are helping their clients rather than
Mhm.
hitting the broad middle sector of just consumers who are listening to Huberman or Rogan." They at least get that Lane Norton voice, and that's probably an important thing now with the new problems of 2024 versus, when my holdover opinions from 2012. So I wish I knew all the answers, and I wish I could look to all of our colleagues in the evidence-based sector, who I think we all are part of the same sector, and say that this is the way you should be doing it. But I do think it's important to have conversations, but I think we also need to acknowledge that many of the people who might have these titles are trying to find a way to hit a lot of people with good information. And I know you're
Mhm.
not necessarily satisfied in all those cases with that information, but I think we also have to consider what the alternatives are in many cases,
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
worse.
If I had to, I don't want to say completely disagree at the assessment between you and Lane per se in terms of the magnitude of effect, because the I would be willing to bet that you have had more of a trickle effect rather than a direct effect
Mm,
through the fact that probably like I would say that your audience is probably a slightly little bit more intellectual and more professional tier, and that's carrying down like each of the each of the people that's paying more attention to the nuances that you were delivering, right, is then having a larger umbrella effect underneath them. So even though you may not directly impact as many people, I think that you probably impact people that impact a larger group of people. And so I wouldn't, not trying, kiss your butt here or anything, but I don't discount that effect, especially as somebody who's also involved more in like the direct education space and stuff with what you guys have with the vault, et cetera, or whatnot, is that when you are appealing to those people that are actually thirsty for that higher level education, you probably have a bigger impact than you realize because you're so focused on just who's directly in front of you consuming the information. And it's almost impossible to quantify then how big of an impact that has exponentially from that point, right? So,
two funny comments on that. One, you brought me on to unblack pill you, and you're unblack pilling me. Thank you, Kassem. Second comment, Lane did inspire my career, so the trump card is that I might not even be doing this if it wasn't Lane.
yeah.
So, hey, you know what? My ego loves that you said that, and I also appreciate that you said that, and thank you, like, sincerely. And I don't know. I think we're all playing. I think the majority of the people who are having some of these debates with each other are playing important roles towards the same thing. And that's an important reminder for us to have, is that if we're actually arguing in good faith, that those people are probably on the same team, even when there's pretty substantial disagreements around what is the best way to deliver this information, or even what is science-based or not. So it's just a good reminder.
So if I can ask you one more thing in closing,
Yes, sir.
it would be building off of the titles, like, is kind of what your avatar or the list of things that you would like to see if something is going to have that science-based branding on it, right? Because if I'm giving my kind of like my complaints about that content as a whole, not like one specific piece, but just like kind of the general trend. And this is not just including like YouTube, but also like Instagram and TikTok, because it kind of it delineates as the platform gets to more and more short form, right? Is just like the consistency of that and the transparency of like when we're like just stating opinion versus like when it's like a lot of the times it's like, oh, it's science, the title says science based, and you watch the video and it will be a mixture of anecdotes and maybe some stuff that I'm intuiting that there was a scientific rationale for this, but there's no actual, I don't know what is based on that. So basically you just have to trust the person that like, oh, if they say it's science based, I'm just assuming that this is right. And so that's one of my things. And then there's also then the portraying of that being somehow superior than any other thing. Cause like as coaches, I think we should be everything based, right? At this point in time, it's got to be a combination of everything. So by definition, if you're saying this is a workout is purely science based, well, then you're kind of limiting, what you can actually do within that workout, right? So the other one I have is basically most of the time it's only looking at a single variable. So it'll be like a best exercise or whatever. And it'll be like, well, all the exercises are being chosen on one single variable. Like we're going through the body parts and it's like, okay, what's the whatever, what's the most stable or what's the, and it's just that one variable across the board rather than actually saying, okay, if I really look at this, what is the overall evidence? And I think sometimes it would be helpful to distinguish between when there's direct evidence versus like we're applying the scientific principles. And sometimes I think actually it's like the other way around. Like somebody will be like, they will do a video on an exercise like, hey, what's the best exercise? And they won't mention the best direct evidence that we actually have for that body part. And I'm like, even if you don't believe this is the best exercise, it's probably at least worth mentioning that like this exercise for sure works, right? Like we could argue that there's better or not, but at least we do have data that says preacher curls are pretty darn good, right? Or leg extension for sure grows the rec fem. If you want to argue that reverse Nordics or something are better, like cool, but it's probably worth mentioning that for sure leg extensions do the job. They are effective. And overall, just let's say like just a lack of consistency in the principles that are applied. Like within the same video, I'll often see like, oh, okay, here's the rationale for this. And then 2 minutes later, be violating that same principle for a different exercise or a different movement. Right. And to me, when I see that, it's just like, okay, are we really applying the scientific principles here? Right. Is this really science-based, or am I just choosing the convenient reference or argument as I go down my list of preferences? Right. So those are my critiques as a whole. I guess
give you an additional one?
Sure.
That's really, I think would be really helpful if anyone, content creators listening to this, and also if someone who's a discerning consumer of content, they should be aware that this is something that would be good to be included. And when you do hear content that includes this, it's a good thing, is giving some description of the magnitude of effect of what is going to occur. So like, for example, it's easy to say that something was superior to another and maybe even be accurately representing the data. But if we're talking about 95% of the, let's say the gains in a given muscle group are identical between these two protocols, and it is going to make a small difference, good content creators who do understand research will state that. And this is a problem that actually does exist within the scientific community itself, because poor statistical knowledge is kind of common in sports science and just relying on p less than 0.05. And now we're seeing this thing where, hey, we have 95% confidence in reporting effect sizes. We even, are understanding different models than null hypothesis testing, Bayesian analyses that kind of give us point estimates. Something that needs to be carried down into practical application. And so, for example, on some of these top 10 lists of exercises, if there's a minuscule difference between the two exercises in terms of the overall effect, and it's positioned as like, this is a really, really big, important thing, that's an issue. And like, that's kind of a hallmark of my career, which I mentioned earlier, is going like, just saying it's better or it's a thing or it works is not enough especially when you have hyperbole behind it. And when everything appears to be the newest, best, most important thing. So we need to be able to put things in context. And I think that's people who don't contextualize information as far as magnitude of effect, consistency of effect, confident in it being an outcome, or in the situations in which it applies, I think generally that's a pretty big red flag, because that is inherently unscientific.
Yeah, I actually am building a disclaimer for lengthened bias training to just every video that we mention. Long muscle lengths will now include this link, and I'll mention like, hey, we have a whole disclaimer on all of the limitations around this topic that you should check out if you haven't, because I mean, otherwise it's going to take up 10 minutes and an additional 10 minutes of every video. So it's like, okay, I'm just going to do this one time and we're just going to put it on all of the stuff, right? That way people, but yeah, I totally agree. That's a good one. So what would be your like must-haves or like to haves in, the content?
Yeah, I think I really agree with some of the things you said. I think anyone who's an evidence-based, like anyone putting out content that is meant to be ideally reliant on both anecdotes in the field when there's an absence of good evidence and really good evidence, is that they're just building into what they're saying, even if they're just a good speaker, where they're operating off as they start to make different claims. That is something that really, really gets me, is, like, oh, we got multiple, and I build it into my speech. So obviously it's something I think is valuable, but like, I'll say, hey, we have multiple meta-analyses that support this. Or, hey, we got a handful of studies and they're all either neutral to positive on this. Or, hey, I'll say, something I've observed through years of coaching, but that we don't have data on. Like, those things take like 5 seconds. And I get it that those 5 seconds are becoming more and more important real estate as I try to make reels for mass that accurately represent a study that are only 90 seconds long every week. But I think that is one of the most important things that people from the kind of more sciencey camp, not that we're really a camp as I've discussed, but since we have an avatar, would be really useful to include. That is I think a must-have. Something I would like to see would be more people unwilling to really let the tail wag the dog as far as following what the algorithm rewards, and just being at least aware of the concessions they're making the more they lean into what is best rewarded on social media, and deciding where they want to draw that line in the sand. And the reason I say I'd like to have it is because I understand why people don't want to draw a line, because it actively hurts their business. But I don't think most people are actually making conscious choices on that. I think they are finding themselves in a certain spot of wherever they're comfortable. But I would like people to actively stop, think, and go, okay, I started with, I'm going to make really good content and then figure out how to promote it. And now I'm starting with, what's the best promotional tool and what content can I fit to it? And I think that is actually a subconscious process that happens, because I've watched it happen to content creators in many cases. So I would like every content creator to actively spend some time thinking about the platforms they're on, their mission statement. And if you don't have a mission statement, develop a mission statement, goddammit. And then figure out, okay, where am I, like, how close to the line can I feel comfortable? And then explore that and revisit it every once in a while. That I think is an unlikely thing that's going to happen, but I think it's an absolute necessity as far as people not letting the tail wag the dog.
Yeah. I think like when you look at the thumbnails, like you'll see like, oh, comparing this versus this. And on one side, it's a Photoshop version of the guy that's, he's just went through a starvation study or something like that. And then the other one, it's, you ask Chat GPT to put you on 6 months of trend. And then, that's like the opposite. I think like when you do that, it becomes even more important to like, one, I'm just not a fan of that period, but I understand that like, okay, that's probably even more powerful than the title. Yeah, like high volume, low volume, and one's huge and one's not. It's like, well, yeah, I don't even need to watch the video at this point. And I think that happens a lot.
Yeah.
And so I think when it comes to the title, like one of the things would be like, look, what are the odds that somebody's going to look at this? They're already going to see, oh, I've already got the conclusion of the video, and then move on. To me, that's where the line is if basically, if you're putting out the messaging where none of what you're actually going to say in the video has any ability to reel that person back in, to me, that's, I think, where you cross the line, because then cool, you could like just showing up in somebody's feed as they're scrolling through the thing. Those are the people that you could be doing harm with. Now, if you're sending this message of, hey, if you train like this, I'm going to look like the guy on the left versus the guy on the right or whatnot.
It's a tough one though, because I also know some YouTubers who you can quite literally see a tenfold difference in views from having the same content with small changes in the thumbnail or the title. And they will if you pay close attention, sometimes you'll see a title change in the first 2 hours of a video coming out and the thumbnail change. And it's because they're tracking the metrics and they got to switch it up. And sometimes they have like 5 titles on a range of I'm moderately comfortable with this level of cringe clickbaitiness to, okay, I'm going to have to make a response video next week because I'm going to get lambasted for this. But they're also going like, I might get 10 times the views if I go with this one. And I would agree with you though, that the views don't necessarily reflect the uptake of the information because they don't necessarily watch it the whole way through. And it doesn't tell you how many people didn't view it because the algorithm fed it to them, but they went, okay, well, I already know the conclusion to that video. So we are at the mercy of the analytics that we even can get if we're even looking at the analytics on these videos. So it's not a simple problem, Cass.
Yeah, I know. That's why we're having these conversations, right? So not that they will even change anything, but it feels good to have them.
Oh, I haven't fully unblackpilled you. Yeah. I've at least made you feel better though. That's good.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like, man, it's that case of just like, am I the asshole? Am I the only one that cares or whatever? Has everybody else just been like, hey, this is just the way it is. You need to get with the program. And I'm the only one that's like holding out. So sometimes like it's just good to know that like, okay, I'm not the only one that wishes things were a little bit different. So cool. Yeah. I think that's a good place to kind of wrap it up there. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for hosting this. My pleasure, Cass. I appreciate it.
And I know these aren't the most like interesting topics. You got your bodybuilding competition that you just got done and all these other fun things that you probably like to talk about. So maybe the next time we chat, we can chat about something that we can both be much more white-pilled and excited about than this science versus whatever debate that isn't really a debate.
No, dude, I think this is a valuable discussion because I think it's a cultural flux right now. And I think having these conversations is important. And I think it does have a measurable impact. I think it's very important.
Thank you. Anything you want to let people know about?
I would just say in general, if people want more thoughts and discussions on stuff like this, like Iron Culture is probably the best source for it, where, I get to have these types of convos regularly, because anyone making it to the end and thinking about that they're probably willing to listen to me talk for hours on end. So I think that's the only thing I'd be comfortable pitching you off of this. And I just appreciate you having me on, man.
Yeah, I'll second that, guys. It's a weekly listen for me as well.
Honored to hear it.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a like, subscribe, and and leave us a review, and we will see you on the next episode of the N1 Experience.